It's Mo. It is mere moments since I finished my May wrap-up, and I wanted to get on here right away because I've already started reading some books in June, which means it is time to do another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've read them as I possibly can. The last few months I've not been doing good at that, hence starting this video immediately. I try to talk for about 5 minutes about each book. I tell you a little bit about the book, I tell you what I thought of it, I tell you how I enjoyed it, if I think you should read it too. I string them all together for one excessively long vlog-style reading wrap-up. The last book that I read in May was Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan, and the first book that I read in June was Ajax Penumbra 1969. So this is a short story novella written after Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, but it is a prequel to that story, and it talks about Ajax Penumbra discovering the things that he discovered that are relevant to Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, so I won't spoil it here, but it's about him kind of discovering things and discovering the bookstore, a little backstory about that character from that book. I read this immediately afterwards, one, because it was a short story, and two, because I really liked being in the Penumbra world. I'm really liking Sloan this year. I read Sourdough by him as well in 2024, and I really have been enjoying just that universe and his writing style and the feeling that it gives me. So I was hoping that going right into Ajax Penumbra 1969, I would feel that way as well, and I did. I did like it. I didn't love it on audio. I have to say that I think I would have preferred reading this book physically. I really liked reading 24-Hour Bookstore physically, and I really liked reading Sourdough physically. There is one other short story in this universe that's out, and I do want to read that one, and I do want to read it soon because I don't want to forget the characters or get out of the mindset of being in that universe, but I wish I had that one physically as well. You can read Ajax Penumbra first if you want. It is a prequel, but I would suggest reading them in publication order, so I would suggest reading 24-Hour Bookstore first and then reading Ajax Penumbra, because I also think the style of Ajax Penumbra is very different. The way that it's written, part of it's written in second person, part of it's written in third person. Not that that's experimental in the grand scheme of things, but experimental for Robin Sloan's writing and the world that he has already created. So if you're not interested in that and you don't like the way that's written, then you might think that all of his stuff is that way and you might not like it. But it's not all that way, so I would suggest starting with 24-Hour Bookstore. The next book that I read in June so far is Even Though I Know the End by C.L. Polk. So this is another audio book that I got from the library, and I've been wanting to read this one. This book was on my 22 books that I found out about in 2022, and I wanted to read in 2023, so I'm not that far behind. I am doing a vlog about those books, so you will see that probably before you see this. Even Though I Knew the End is a short crime noir sci-fi fantasy novella. Even Though I Knew the End takes place in a alternate 1940s Chicago, and we meet our main character, who is a private eye. Immediately we see her on the case that she has taken to make an extra $50 from her employer, a frequent employer of hers who has given her many jobs over the years, but who is a little bit, obviously right off the bat, we know, a shady character. So our main character figures out that this job is bigger than she thought it was going to be, bigger than she wanted, but she doesn't have time to think about that because she has to run off and meet her girlfriend at the club, which is a secret speakeasy for lesbian and other queer people in this timeline. So we meet our main character, we find out that she has an estranged brother, we find out about her kind of shady employer, we find out about the love of her life, and we find out that she knows that she is going to die soon, and she's trying to get things ready, prepare her life for that eventuality. So that's stuff that you find out right in the beginning in the first 20 minutes. Other than that, I'm not going to say much because this is extremely short, and I didn't really know where it was going to go exactly. I didn't know how magical it was going to get, how fantasy it was going to get. I didn't know how the alternate timeline was going to work. Something that I really liked about it was the alternate timeline and the kind of noir detective aspect of our PI main character. You know I love a good noir PI, especially a gay sapphic one. That's great. Even though I knew the end is very fast-paced and action-packed, and you definitely have to like pay attention. There was a couple times where I had to go back in the book because I was doing something else and I missed something. This is a very short audiobook, and I would suggest just sitting down and reading it all in one go, or, you know, making sure that when you do get to read it, you are paying attention because it moves pretty fast. This was another book that I cried at the end for the same reason as I cried at the end as a book last month, which I won't go into, but it was unexpected, and at the end I like burst into tears. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that C.L. Polk is a non-binary author, which is very exciting, and I would definitely read more of their work. Those were the first two books that I read in June, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is June 16th, and I have read quite a few more books in June. So let's talk about them now. I finished They by Kay Dick, which is a kind of forgotten modern queer classic or modern classic. And this is a dystopian, very short, told in like 4 little chapters or stories. And we follow our main character, who is a woman who is totally happy living on her own. She is a writer, and she is doing what she can to comply with the new regime while still flying under the radar, but doing subversive acts like continuing her writing and her artistic endeavors, and also communicating with people and spreading love and spreading joy and making sure that she's saying hello to people on the street and trying to overcome the oppressive nature of this new dystopian government and overarching ideals. So our main character is not supposed to be living alone, so she often will let visitors into her house because that's seen as appropriate, and she will continue her job because this new kind of government sees having a purpose as being important. She will always be happy and cheery no matter how scary and disturbing the environment that she has to live in is, because that is seen as important in this new society. And she has gathered around her a group of friends, some of which who live very close, some of which whom live far away, and she tries to keep up these relationships, partly to keep herself from going crazy in this new regime, and also partly to subversively continue living life to the fullest. So you're never really told what the government nature is, you're never really told who they are, you're never really told what the circumstances that brought this about are, but you quickly see that there are some people who are trying to be artistic, trying to be a creative, trying to live their lives and be happy within the government that has been created, within the environment that has been created. And everyone is very like suspicious. You know, her neighbor is always like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Her guests that she has that come stay are often potential spies that are looking to expose her and her lifestyle. And her friends who live alone, she worries about, because you're not supposed to be living alone. You're supposed to be coupling up. You're supposed to be procreating. You're supposed to be living the right life. And so it's definitely queer in the idea that you are unsure whether some of these people are gay or whether they're straight, and just the idea of being different is very wrong in this new society. So she tries to fit in as much as she can, but you're not supposed to be like kind or generous to people. You're not supposed to be like nice. You're supposed to be like polite but unattached. So oftentimes she'll ask the air and just practice being nice to people and say like, how are you? Like, I hope you're well. I hope you're okay. Because she's not allowed to do that in real life, but it's something that like keeps her going. So the story's told in like 4 different little stories. Sometimes she's going to visit a friend and the problems that that causes. Sometimes she's just at her home. Sometimes people are visiting her and how she has to be careful. And a lot of the stories contain repercussions that people face for not not following this new government, this new society. So one of the things that this new society hates is like grief or being sad. So you have to seem happy all the time, even though you're terrified of them and what they might do to you. We see some people falling into their grief and therefore going to facilities to be corrected. So it was really interesting, very short. I read this book on audio and I read it for my reading books off of my 2022 list. I'd heard really mixed things about They. People seem to not like it, but I thought it was excellent. It doesn't have like a firm plot or a firm conclusion. It's more vibes and it's more just about the dread feeling that you get being with our main character and seeing the struggles that she has and seeing the like underlying fear and depression that she is suffering from this new society and the worry that she has. But I really, really liked it. I thought it was great. If you're interested in any kind of like dystopian and certainly like forgotten modern classics. Hi, Marty. The next book that I read was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is a sapphic love story and a sci-fi told partly in epistolary style where we see two warring factions on opposite sides of a time war. So we meet Red and Blue and they are time agents and they're going forward and backward and throughout time and different timelines and different time strands, and they're fighting this war on opposite sides. But both of them are special in some way and they've become kind of like super agents. So when they find each other, when they clash on the battlefield, they're both enamored of the other because they're on each other's level, because they're the only worthy opponents that they have actually faced from the opposing side. So they start up a conversation in letters, and throughout time and throughout different planets and throughout different histories and throughout different timelines, they are leaving each other letters to find. And that's the whole story of This Is How You Lose the Time War. And as the story goes on, we see them forming a relationship. We learn about the different ideas of the different societies who are in this time war. We learn about different time periods in history. We learn about Blue and Red's lives and their histories, and it's a very quick read. I read this over a couple of days, but I think you could really just sit down and read the whole thing at once because it's a little snippet of their current story, wherever they happen to be, whatever that current is, and then there's a letter that the other one wrote. And throughout the book, there's also kind of an ominous potential threat stalking our agents Red and Blue, not to mention that if either of their superiors find out about these letters, they'll be killed. So it was, yeah, really compelling, really interesting. I think the only reason that I read it over a few days and not kind of all at once was just like what was going on with my life. I think if you sat down and read this in a sitting or two, it would be like really engrossing and really engaging. I did really enjoy this book. I've heard so much hype over it. People love it so much, and I was super glad to get to this BookTube darling. This was also on, was this on a list? I think this was on a list of mine. Maybe it was on my 24 and 24. I don't know. I can't remember, but I'm super happy to have gotten to it. I thought it was all epistolary, which I would have liked as well, but I think actually it was cool to see some of the current timeline and then also the letters, which was neat, and the way the letters were done was neat, and the sci-fi of the timelines was cool. I like that. I like the relationship. I do think that the voices of Red and Blue were very similar. It was easy to distinguish which was which and who was writing by the way it was written, but I think their voices were very similar, which I think could have been improved upon. Like, I think their voices could have been more distinct, and that would have just made you connect more with one or the other or both of the characters. I've also heard people say that this book was really confusing and they didn't understand what was going on, but I wonder if those people are not people who read a lot of sci-fi or don't suspend their disbelief in that way, because I did not think this book was confusing at all. I thought it was, if anything, pretty like obvious and very like clear what was happening right from the beginning. There was not really a lot of ambiguity over that these two people were in a time war, and it does say it in the title of the book. I've heard that criticism. I didn't find that to be a problem at all. I really enjoyed this one. If you're interested in a quick, fun, gay sci-fi, I would definitely give this one a try. The next book that I finished in June was Cherry Blossoms. This is Japanese haiku series number 3, so it is the third in these adorable little Peter Popper Press books of haikus, and they are divided into seasons. So for Cherry Blossoms, we start at the very tail end of winter, beginning of spring, when cherry blossom season happens in Japan, and then we hear haikus going through spring, summer, fall, and winter, written by various ancient and classic haiku artists. So we have Basho, we have Issa, we have Bushan, we have Shiki, and many others. And they're all these little Japanese haikus. I've really enjoyed this series. I really like Peter Popper Press, and I've started collecting their books. I found Poor Richard's Almanac, sadly with this Goodwill sticker that I have to try and get off, which is, I've never seen the Peter Popper Press in this large format, but like, how cute is that? So this is I guess an almanac or a story by Benjamin Franklin. Interesting. I just love their books. I just think they're beautiful. I like these Peter Popper Press editions of the haikus specifically because there's a little introduction to haiku and a little introduction to like what haikus are about and what the art form, what the poetry form is for or representing, which I think is nice. So it gives you like a little context if you're new to poetry, if you're new to haiku, if you're new to Japanese traditional poetry. It gives you a little context into what it's all about, which is nice. I think there's 4 in this haiku series, but I only have 3, and I have read all 3 that I have, so I will definitely be keeping my eye out for more of these and more Peter Popper Press in general. The next book that I finished in June was The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. This is the 4th novel by Catherine Steadman that I have read, and I just really love her writing. I think she could definitely be considered one of my favorite authors just because I'll read everything she writes. I think that her work is super fun. I think it's like silly and bananas thrillers, which is the kind of thrillers that I like. And I really like her main characters. I think although all her main characters are quite similar, they also have differences that make me enjoy reading from them. So Catherine Steadman is an English author, but she always writes stories about an English woman coming to America or being in a different place than England, which I think is really fun. It immediately puts you in the mind of this kind of fish out of water. These women are all trying to navigate their new locations, their new environments, and then of course there's thrilling things that happen. In Family Game, we meet Harriet Reed, who is an English writer, and she has decided that she's going to like make her claim in America, so she comes over to America, and in Manhattan she meets a rich man who she quickly falls in love with. So she's been in America for about a year, she's been in New York for about a year, and for most of that time she has been in a relationship with this man, and they are taking it to the next level. One of the things that she hasn't done yet with this man is meet his family. So he's estranged from his family in a lot of ways. They're this super rich, you know, Upper West Side, crazy rich family that is seemingly well-meaning, but also like live on a totally different plane than our main character Harriet lives. She gets introduced to the family. Part of the mystery is kind of figuring out why her husband is estranged from them. Her husband is seemingly like this perfect guy, and he's seemingly distanced himself from them for reasons, and because they're overbearing, because they're crazy, because they're rich beyond their means, they can manipulate things, and he doesn't want to be a part of that. So Harriet sees the truth in that very quickly upon meeting the family. One of the examples is that the sister wants to have an afternoon with Harriet, and Harriet has to decline because she has an appointment, and the sister goes in and manipulates her appointment and changes her plans, frees her up so that the sister can spend time with her. So like right off the bat, Harriet is trepidatious about this family, but she knows that if she wants to be in love with her boyfriend, if she wants to get married, if, you know, she wants a future, she's going to have to figure out how to navigate this family, and the story goes from there. And then so of course there's some like weird things, some family games that this family plays that Harriet has to decide whether she's going to participate in or not. I liked Harriet as a character. I like that she was like not dumb. Sometimes Catherine Steadman's characters they're not dumb. Oh, here's a whisker. They're not dumb women. They're not stupid. But I do think that they sometimes make decisions that are based on their misunderstanding of situations. And Harriet does do that to a certain extent. A lot of times, Catherine Steadman's main characters will be totally confident in what they need to do and what's going on, but they are missing like a huge part of the picture by their own kind of arrogance. And I don't think Harriet was like that. Like, I think Harriet was very measured, and she definitely like tried her best to understand like the situation that was happening. I do also think that Catherine Steadman's books are pretty predictable. I think you can kind of see where it's going. Maybe you can't anticipate every twist and turn, but you can definitely see where the story is going and what some of the big reveals or big twists are. But I think that they're so fun and fast-paced that you really don't mind that, and that you are just willing to like go along for the ride and see, even though you might know the big twist, see like how we get to that big twist. So The Family Game was no different. The first book that I read by Catherine Steadman is still my favorite, so it goes Mr. Nobody, and then I think Family Game, then what was that one? The Disappearing Act, then Something in the Water. But I think The Disappearing Act and Something in the Water are very close. I think I would have liked Something in the Water better if I didn't have so much expectations about that story. But I still think Mr. Nobody is my favorite. Maybe it's because it's the first book that I read by her, so it was the first time that I've read her characters and the first time that I've read her twists. But I really thought The Family Game was super fun, and I liked where this one went and some of the different aspects of this story. If you're looking for like fun, fast-paced thrillers, silly, not too gory, not too intense, nothing like really graphic. I mean, there are some graphic scenes, people being injured or people being killed, but there's no like rape, extreme like sexual content. There's no extreme violence, you know, like extreme horror violence that you would have to deal with. I definitely suggest picking up Catherine Steadman's thrillers. The next book that I finished in June was Baby Cakes. This is my ongoing read/reread of Olmsted Maupin's Tales of City books. So I've read book 1 many, many times, book 2 a couple of times, book 3 twice, I think, and the last time was last year in June for Pride Month. And then I've never actually read book number 4, which is Baby Cakes. But it follows our same characters from Tales of the City. It follows Marianne Stapleton and Michael Mouse. It follows Mona and John and Brian and Mrs. Madrigal, who all found each other because they ended up living in Mrs. Madrigal's apartment building in San Francisco. So this is a super fun, super soapy, super wacky, very gay story that takes place in the 70s and goes to basically the present day. The most recent and possibly last book in the series came out in 2024. So we see these characters grow in character and in time and in space and in location throughout the books. The first book, Tales of the City, we see like kind of our main character, Marianne Singleton, coming from Iowa or Ohio or somewhere in the Midwest, seeing San Francisco for the first time, experiencing queerness, experiencing all sorts of things, sex, drugs, that she never thought she would experience or could experience or she had no understanding of, and finding Mrs. Madrigal's apartment building, and we see her story of how she decides to move to San Francisco. And throughout that, we meet all the other characters. In the first book and in subsequent books, we're pretty evenly split between Marianne and a bunch of other characters, but the further the books go on, the more different characters we meet, and sometimes we hear just their stories in a chapter. The Tales of the City books were originally serialized, so all the chapters are very, very short, a page or two. They have wide margins, big font, and they're very short little chapters for each person. So we're able to flit between each storyline, between each person, between each connection very easily, very fast. So even if you're not like loving Brian's story, you only have a couple of pages to read until you get to the next one. And one of the great things about Tales of the City is that they all connect in some way. They're constantly in communication, all this group of friends, all this community of people. They definitely deal with heavy topics. They deal with hard things. They deal with the AIDS crisis. In Baby Cakes, we see the AIDS epidemic really affecting our characters and really touching them, and other things as well, like gay bashing and violence against queer people come into play in these stories, and a lot of other things. But they're also told in such a totally campy, soapy way that even some serious topics, not like the AIDS epidemic, but some serious topics like infidelity and trust issues and familial relationships are dealt with in a very campy way. So even if there's a heavy moment, even if there's hard things talked about, it always then does take a light turn as well. I really liked reading Baby Cakes, and actually if I had the 5th in the series, which is one of the few books that I don't have yet, I would have moved on and read it immediately after this, because it's just such a fun world to be immersed in, such a fun place, and you just love these characters so much. And in this book, a lot of the characters are at odds with each other or estranged from each other, so finding out what happens to them is really compelling. If you are queer or you love queer literature, this is a foundational text. These are foundational books. This is a foundational series. You should definitely be reading Tales of the City. The next book that I read in June was The Sugared Game, which is number 2 in the Will Darling series. So I read the first Will Darling, which I can't remember what that one's called. Let me see. I read Slippery Creatures, which is the first in the Will Darling series, a couple of years ago, and I just happened to stumble upon it on a free audio site, so I picked it up. These are pretty steamy male-male romances following Will Darling, who returns from World War I and the traumas that he faced there and the things that he went through, to a England where there's no work for him, there's no place for him kind of in society. He doesn't have very much family, but the one family member that he does have is an uncle who runs a bookshop. So he goes to see his uncle, and unfortunately his uncle passes away, but fortunately for Will, he inherits his uncle's bookstore. So now Will at least has a purpose and a place, but he soon finds out that his uncle might have been embroiled in something bigger than what Will suspects, and when various people come into the bookshop demanding things, wanting things, demanding information that Will does not have, he gets caught up in espionage and thrilling escapade, and he meets a young man named Kim, and they form a relationship. So Will Darling is queer, but he has not been able to fully explore his queerness, and he doesn't fully understand his own sexuality, and Kim definitely helps him learn more about himself, and there are quite a few steamy sex scenes in all of these books. Basically that's the premise of the first book, and in the second book we see Will and Kim after those adventures that we went through with them in Slippery Creatures, how the first few chapters of this book, Kim has kind of gone missing from Will's life, and Will is missing him. Will is struggling with his desire for Kim and his desire to find Kim, but also like he's dealing with his own life. He has friends and he has responsibilities within the bookshop that keep him busy as well. But of course, Kim does come back into Will's life and throws it into chaos once again. And Kim's family and friends and Will's friends are all involved in the adventure that happens in The Sugared Game. So I really like these books. I think they're super fun. I like the relationship between Kim and Will, and we see a lot more of that in Sugared Game, and we see a lot more of them dealing with their own sexuality and also them dealing with like loving each other and falling in love and wanting to protect each other. But oftentimes they protect each other and other people in their lives by not being completely honest with them. And then of course these are like spy, espionage, mystery novels, so we're always trying to find out the mysteries that are involved. We're connecting different people and different places and different things that happen. There's a lot of action in these and a lot of tough decisions in those action moments that both Kim and Will have to make. So it's super fun, fast-paced espionage, thrilling mysteries is what I would kind of call them. They're definitely not thrillers, and they're not fully mysteries. They're more like spy novels. But then there's also the relationships that form throughout friends, family, and lovers, and at the center of that is Kim and Will's relationship. So these are really fun. There's one more in the series that I know of, so I'm definitely planning on reading more of the Will Darling series, and I would definitely read more KJ Charles. I don't know what else they write, but I think that they probably write romances and steamy romances in general, and you know, that's fine. That sounds good to me. Clearly, I'm reading a lot of books for Pride Month, and I think that the Will Darling series is perfect for that because it is a lot about navigating queerness at a time when it was not only not accepted, but not really understood either. Next, I read We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Bervowitz, who is a Dutch author, and this was translated by Christine Fram. And this is a very, very short novella. I read this book on audio, and I didn't actually know that this was queer, or I didn't remember this was queer. I just knew that it had to do with content moderators. So our main character is a young woman who's worked at like a call center and different places that were hard to work at, and customer service that were hard to work at, and dealing with topics that were hard to, pretty stressed out. She takes a job as a content moderator, and she sees kind of the toll that this takes on all her coworkers because of the stress of the environment of the work, and also because of the horrible things that they have to look at every day, because they are the people who say whether something is too horrific to go on the internet. They need to look at those horrific things. She sees her coworkers, you know, kind of deteriorate over time. So she has never really had friends. She's never really been close to anyone. She's had some girlfriends in the past that didn't work out, and she starts dating a woman who works with her and quickly falls in love with her, quickly becomes completely like obsessed with her, but also finds like friendship and companionship in these people who work in this very strict environment. Throughout the novella, we start to see how this content moderation is affecting people, that they're either becoming super detached, that they're walking in and stabbing each other, how they are trying to compartmentalize their work and their other lives. And it's a really interesting little novella about like the psychological effects of seeing the horrible things that happen in life. So like, I do think that although these people are content moderators for a website or for the web in general, it can be equated to like the horrors that we see every day and how that is taking a toll on us without even realizing it. The wars, the genocides, the abuse, the really inhumane things that happen all the time, and how even like snippets of that, watching it or hearing about it or having it imprinted on your brain in any way is like devastating to humanity and to people, how we live life and how we try to not succumb to those horrors of life. So for that, I thought it was really interesting. It didn't go where I expected it to. It didn't end the way I expected it to. I don't know if I really expected very much at all. I was glad that there was queer representation in this, but it definitely wasn't a happy story. It definitely doesn't have a happy ending. It definitely is not a uplifting queer book. I was glad that it worked for Pride Month, but I've been reading a lot of happy queer books. Even the Will Darling books are not unhappy books, even though they contain murder, even though they contain hardships. Same with Tales of the City. These are mostly happy books and have happy endings for queer characters. If you're looking for that, I wouldn't suggest We Had to Remove This Post. But if you're looking for a super short, fast-paced, interesting, thought-provoking, especially if you're looking for that, all that in a translated work, I would definitely recommend We Had to Remove This Post. And that's all that I've read so far in June. We still have basically half the month to go, so I will be reading some more. And when I do, I will check in with you. It is well into July. I was not able to film most of my last books and the wrap-up of the wrap-up. So let's try to figure out where I left off. I think the last book that I talked about was Our Wives Under the Sea, and if it was not, I'll pop back in with a review of that. The next book that I read in June was Dogs of Summer by Adrian Abreu Lopez, and this was translated by Julia Sanchez. So this was another short audiobook that I read because I was in need of a short audiobook and I was reading translated works, and this was another audiobook much like We Had to Remove This Post that I didn't realize was queer, or I didn't remember was queer until I started reading it. Dogs of Summer is about two young girls, and it's told from the perspective of our main character, who is unnamed in actual name, but her friend has a name for her, and that's kind of what she goes by in the book. But so our main character is talking about her best friend and their life together. It's all told from a child perspective, and it's about these two best friends and like all the things that they get into growing up in Tenerife, like a small town in Tenerife, not too far from the shore. And their whole aim and goal is to like get to the beach and kind of be one of the popular people who can go to the beach. It has a lot to do with like growing up before your time, or thinking that you're grown up when you're not. It has a lot to do about exploring your boundaries and your roles as a young person. But as far as plot goes, it's very much in the vein of, what was that one I read by Jamaica Kincaid, Annie John or Ellen Foster, similar even to, in some ways, Foster by Claire Keegan, like the idea of just a young person's life from their perspective. So you're a little bit out of time, you're a little bit out of place, you're just seeing things as they happen to these young people. And our two main characters in Dogs of Summer are going through their summer and the feelings that they feel towards each other, the boundaries that they're pushing towards their elders, the exploration of their bodies, of their sexuality, how they feel about friends and other children in the area. And it's definitely one of those like visceral books that talks a lot about like potty humor and gross things about the body. It talks about your body changing, and in a very visceral and gross way, like hair growing on your body and sweating and all those adolescent things that happen to everyone, but from the perspective of these children. As the summer goes on, we see the friendship progress and the feelings of our main character change towards her best friend, and the kind of, again, from a child's perspective, what big changes could be. So, you know, how we're not sure as the reader if those changes are the perspective of a child, or if they are actual happenings, or if the child narrator understands some of the larger repercussions of things that have gone on in the story. And it's a really interesting book. I didn't love the like potty humor. I didn't love the like gross body aspects. I just personally don't like reading things like that. I don't like talking about things like that. I don't like listening to things like that. It was a little bit hard to get past those aspects of it to enjoy this book, but looking back at it, it's not necessarily the thing that I remember most. I think I remember most kind of the naivete of that child narrator, and then also the grown-up feeling that they have, or the knowledgeable feeling that they have, that idea of kids thinking that they know everything and feeling like they have an understanding of the world, but you as an adult reader know that they have no understanding of the world, and as events happen in their life, how that understanding or that feeling of understanding that they have changes. I definitely would put this in the same category, like if you like stories like Annie John by Jamaican Cade, Ellen Foster by Kay Gibbons, Foster by Claire Keegan, if you like those stories told from a child narrator, if you like those stories about childhood and really being in the feels of childhood as they're growing up, this would be a good one. And then it does have queer aspects as well. And I liked the queerness in this because it wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't necessarily like explicitly said, but it also was explored. So it was an interesting idea of when you're growing up queer and how you don't have a word for it yet. You don't know what it's called. You don't know that other people are going to look down on it. You only know your feelings and that you have feelings for the same sex and that you find excitement through the same sex in some aspects. But again, like it's not very sexual in this book because our main characters are very young. So there is an aspect of queerness and of sexuality, but more in that exploratory way that children are learning about their bodies and other bodies. So it's not like overly sexualized, even though there are seemingly sexual elements to this book. I did end up enjoying it. It wasn't like my absolute favorite, but I would definitely read more from this author, and I was, again, super surprised and happy that this was not only a translated work, but a queer work as well. The next book that I read in June was also a queer work. This one I knew was queer, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea. So I read this for my 22 books I found out about in 2022, and I wanted to read in 2023 list, and also the vlog I did. I've talked about it before in this video, so you can check that out. I will have it listed down below. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfeld is a soft sci-fi queer work about two wives, one of whom is a deep sea diver and goes on a deep sea mission, and the other wife is left behind to wait for her wife to return. But when her wife returns, something has gone wrong. The mission took longer than it should have. The establishment that was running the mission doesn't communicate well. The wife that's been left at home fears that her wife has died on this mission, but when her wife does eventually come home, things are not as they should be. Even though this is told from both perspectives, the main character, the wife that stayed home, has to grapple with trying to find answers from the corporation that sent her wife on this mission, has to try and find answers from her wife herself, has to grapple with the idea that although her wife didn't die, something did go wrong and her wife is not the same person as she was before. Like I said, this was told in two perspectives. We get the perspective of our main character, the wife who is at home, and we get that like in the current day after her wife has returned from the sea, and as she's trying to navigate figuring out answers, as she's trying to communicate with her wife, and the frustration and the fear and the anxiety that that's giving her, the depression that's giving her. And then we see flashbacks from the wife who went on the deep sea mission, and we find out a little bit more about this mission and a little bit more about what happened down in the sea. And that is like, again, kind of flashbacks, so that's not in the current day. So the timelines are moving forward, the flashbacks are moving forward to the present day, and the present day is moving forward to more present days. I really did enjoy this one. It reminded me a lot of Annihilation. It's very similar in a lot of ways to Annihilation. There was some other books that it reminded me of too. I think this is a story that's definitely been told before. I haven't read Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant or any of those books, but you know, the books that I have read where someone goes on a mission and comes back and they're not the same person. This mission, this expedition, this exploration has irrevocably changed them is a very common theme, I think, but I don't think it's one that you could like tell too much. It does have a juxtaposition to like relationships and how people change in relationships. It does have themes of like growing up and growing apart. You know, you could read a lot more into this than just the surface story, but I think this was the surface story in a lot of ways. I did really like Julia Armfeld's writing, and I liked the way that the flashbacks were done, although again, they weren't anything new necessarily. They weren't anything like super innovative. This book was definitely not innovative. It was not doing anything that hasn't been done before, but I enjoyed what it did do and how it did the thing that has been done before. So I would definitely read more from Julia Armfeld. This is a booktube darling. It wasn't as much of a hit with me as it has been with other people. I think if you've read a story like this before, if you've read Annihilation and the Southern Reach trilogy in general, it can't be like a super, super favorite because like it's not doing anything to like surprise or shock you. Like the first story that you read of this ilk is going to be the one that change your perspective on the story, like that let you in on the story. So you're going to like that one probably the best, but you can enjoy and appreciate other stories, and that's how I felt about this. And those were 2 more books that I read in June. So the next book that I read in June was If I Survive You by Jonathan Escofferys. This was on my 24 books for 2024, and it was a Booker shortlisted or longlisted book. It was one that I found at my local used bookstore's annual sale last year, and it's really, really pretty. I love the end papers. I love the cover. All the chapters have this pretty illustration as well. I remember this being very controversial because it is sort of a collection of short stories, and it is sort of a novel told in short stories. It was debatable whether it should have actually been up for the Booker Prize or not. Definitely seems like it is autobiographical or at least autofiction. And our main character, Trelawney, is kind of the link that links everything together through this book. We start out meeting Trelawney and his family and the story of him when he was younger, and then we see through various stories about his parents, how his father left the family, how his mother chose to move the kids to a different location, how later his father ended up taking his older brother back to Miami with him. And Miami definitely plays a central role in a lot of these stories and is a character of its own in some of these stories, but it's always like kind of looming around the stories, even if it's not a main component of the story. In some stories, we see just Trelawney and his life as his life is progressing. Sometimes we see Trelawney's father and the history there. Sometimes we see cousins of Trelawney, or we learn more about different characters. It reminded me a lot of Lot by Brian Washington, which I read earlier this year, in that it's revolving all around this place and it has a lot to do with the same family, and there are some offshoots and some branches that branch off from the main characters in the story. But unlike Lot, I thought that this one was much more connected and could definitely be considered more of a novel told in short stories. I don't know if it 100% pulled that off. Like, the stories are much more connected than the stories in Lot. Lot has a lot of stories that are not to do with the same family at all, and this one did not. This one all revolves around that family in some way. So in that way, I think it was much more connected, and it gave me what I wanted from Lot. I didn't really want to hear all those other stories. I really just wanted to hear about the main kind of auto-fiction story that was going on. So I liked it for that. I do think If I Survive You is very dark. It's very bleak. It's definitely about racism and fitting in, you know, when you are part of various groups and don't feel part of any of them. So our main character is black and American, but he is light-skinned, so a lot of people think he's Latinx. He lives and comes from Miami, so a lot of people think that he should be Latinx because of that. And he never really fits in, and a lot of the stories revolve around him at various stages of his life, trying to figure out who he is and where he belongs. But like, none of these stories end happily. None of them have a good ending. None of them are anything about like black joy or the joy of being any of the identifications that you might identify with. So it was a really tough read. I did really like the writing. I appreciated that some of the stories were told in different perspectives. There was like a story in second person, there was stories in first person, there were stories in third person. They weren't told in like drastically different ways, but they were definitely told in different ways. So I enjoyed that, and I would definitely read more by this author. But if you're looking for like a happy story, or even a story with uplifting elements, this one is not for you. I definitely ended up liking it, and like I said, I would definitely read more from Jonathan Scottfries. Glad that I read it. Next book that I read was Worst Wingman Ever, which is a short story by Abby Jimenez. I got this from one of my subscriptions for free, and I just needed like a really quick hour audiobook that I could read in between other things. Worst Wingman Ever follows a woman who's taking care of her grandmother as her grandmother is dying. She is a hospice nurse, but she is definitely not as close to her clients as she is to her grandmother, so it's very difficult for her to deal with the death of her grandmother, and she's having to go to her grandmother's apartment complex every day and take care of her grandmother as she's dying. So one of the days there's a note left on her car, and it's like free sex, like Happy Valentine's free sex or whatever, and she's like, what the heck is this? I don't know what's going on. And then we switch perspectives and we see the person who put the note on her car mistakenly, he was doing a favor for his brother, so he picked the wrong car. There were a lot of the same cars in the parking lot and he picked the wrong car. So the next day he goes back and he leaves another note saying like, I'm so sorry, I apologize for leaving that note. And then they start talking through notes in the parking lot, never meeting, and it's very cute. Eventually, of course, they do meet and it's very cute. I really like this one. It was really sad. I think I teared up at parts of it because it definitely packed an emotional punch for such a very, very short story. And I kind of feel the same way about the other Abby Jimenez that I read, which was the one, you know, the one that she's known for. What is it? Part of Your World. Part of Your World was the other Abby Jimenez I read, and I did like that one, and I think I did tear up at a part of that too, because I think she does a really good job of very quickly getting you attached to the characters or getting you attached to people that they're attached to. Very fun, very short, worth checking out, and like, sweet. The next book that I read in June was Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. I tried to read this before. I picked this up recently, this year, I think at a little free library. I read like the first couple of sentences and I was like, ooh, I don't know if this is going to be for me, because this is a cozy mystery that breaks the fourth wall, that talks direct to reader, and I just wasn't sure if I was going to like that. But like some of the other mysteries that I've read this year, it definitely pays homage to a lot of the classic mysteries, the Golden Age mysteries that I love, and I ended up really, really liking this one. It took me a little while to get into it and to get into that voice, get into the flow of it, but once I did, I really enjoyed it. So, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone is about our main character who is going to see his family at a required family trip. So you don't know why he hasn't seen his family in a while when the book first starts. You don't know why he's required to go on this trip, but he ends up going to this kind of remote mountain resort with all of his family. Stepfather, his stepsister, his wife, his mother, his sister-in-law, aunt, his brother, and you also learn about other members of the family, and true to the title, everyone in the family has killed someone. So it's a fun story because it's definitely eked out of who you meet, and it's told in different chapters, all having to do with each member of the family. In the beginning, it tells you like when deaths occur, because deaths do occur, and like what the rules of mysteries are according to our main character. Our main character is a self-published author, but he doesn't write mysteries. He writes like how to write a mystery books, digital versions online. And it's just fun because he obviously like knows the tropes, knows the ideas that are behind mysteries, knows like the different twists and turns that they might take, and he uses that to talk to the reader, and obviously the author uses that to talk to us as the reader, and it's just a really fun time, super fast paced. I read it in like 2 days. It's a little over 250 pages, super good time, much better and much more fun and compelling than I thought it would be, and I'm very excited to read the next book, which is Everyone on This Train is a Suspect. The last book that I read in June was Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. This one is an arc that I found in a little free library a long time ago. before 2022, and I'm so happy that I finally got to it. I read one other River Solomon, which was The Deep, and I really did enjoy that one. That one was much shorter. This one is very long, but both talk about colonialism, slavery, the idea of black spaces, and how black spaces are often created by oppression and racism, and how not all of those black spaces are safe. Starland follows Vern, who has escaped into the woods. She's 15, she's pregnant, and she's living on her own in the woods. As she gives birth, as she raises her children, we learn more about where she escaped from, we learn more about why she's on her own, and she might have to go back to those who drove her out in the first place. So this one's really interesting. It definitely has a weird, lyrical, disjointed storytelling style. I read this one mostly on audio, although I did flip through some of the pages as well. It's told in different parts, and then those parts are broken up into little chapters as well, and we learn about Vern. We meet her children when they come into the world. We learn about how she survives in the woods, and as the parts progress, so does Vern's story, so does Vern's journey out of the woods and into different places. We learn about where she came from, why she left, and we meet a cast of characters that help her in her journey. And we meet a cast of characters that hinder her in her journey. There's a little bit of a love story in here, there's queerness, there's disability rep, there's albinism rep, and lots of different interesting concepts and ideas. I do think that this was a little long, and I think some things could have been condensed down to make it a little bit more fast-paced. It just ended up being a very slow burn. But there's also a lot of action in this book, a lot of exciting things happen, a lot of chase scenes, fight scenes, thrilling moments, hiding, running, lots of those kind of scenes as well. But in between, there's very long stretches of kind of slow burn aspects of the book, whether that be learning about what's actually going on, or whether that be the romance, or whether that just be learning how Vern is surviving. I really like this one. I thought it was really interesting. I definitely love River Solomon's writing, and I like the way things are described and explained in their writing, and I would definitely always read more from this author. This book didn't go the way that I thought it was going to go. It had a lot more like sci-fi and fantasy elements than I expected it to have, but I guess that makes sense because the other book that I read was similar to that in a lot of ways. Very different stories, which I appreciated. So happy to have read this one. This is definitely one of the most beautiful covers of a book that I have. I kind of wish it was a finished copy, but it's fun that it's an ARC too. And those were all the books that I read in June. I was so happy to read so many queer books. And a lot of the books that I read had like one queer character in it too, which I like. Like, I don't mind if I don't want them to be shoehorned in, but I definitely don't mind if there are one queer character in a book written by a straight person. Like, I appreciate that diversity and I appreciate that inclusion, so I definitely don't mind that at all. I read a lot of mysteries. I read a lot of things that had mysterious or thrilling moments in them, even if they weren't actual mysteries. I was able to make progress in a series that I love. I was able to read another sort of series or volume of poetry. I read so many translated works, which was awesome. I read Cherry Blossoms. I read We Had to Remove This Post. I read Dogs of Summer. Another in a queer series that I was happy to continue was The Sugared Game. I read a bunch of books from a bunch of lists that I've had, including I Will Survive You. I read one of my favorite authors with a super fun, fast-paced mystery. I've read books that have been on my TBR for so long that I've been wanting to get to. I read super new books that I just picked up this year. So I had a great reading month. I read a lot of queer books. I read a lot of books on audio, so many. I read a lot of books from lists, But overall, it was a great reading month. Let me know what you read for Pride Month. Let me know what you read in June. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.